I'm going to go quickly at the beginning of the introduction, and I want to ask your indulgence just to listen for a few minutes without questions and without criticisms. And by that I mean the ability to listen and not immediately form a criticism or a response is really important to learning and communication. And the reason is what you heard from Niels a couple days ago. We are designed to immediately justify our inner biases and prejudices. So when someone starts talking, if it violates or contradicts your impulses, which you might call your political philosophy, but in most cases it really is an impulse, you start developing an argument against what you're hearing, with the result that you never hear it. You hear your own arguments over and over. And that's often the problem with our politics today, is people only hear their own arguments. They don't hear anybody else's. So I want to talk to you for the first 10 minutes or so about who we are, how we learn, why history, and how it relates to the way that America designed the government. And then we'll get into the workings of the government, and then it's ole ole and free. So thank goodness Niels gave you a better than I could description of how we operate as human beings. Do you remember he was talking about level 1 and level 2 and the intuitive brain versus the analytical brain? This is really critical. So I'm not going to go back through all that, but let's just say that that's how we operate. 98% of the time we're operating out of our intuitive brain, from feelings that we don't necessarily consciously even understand. And then we use those feelings in our intuitive brain and we make up stories to make them make sense. When you say to yourself, how could somebody believe that in the face of all the evidence to the contrary? The answer is their intuitive brain finds a way to write a story that overcomes the contradiction for themselves. Most notably the people who think climate change is a conspiracy to make us stop driving cars. You can follow their argument and every step of the way prove it's wrong, but it doesn't matter, because in their head they have a story about why it's right. So he already talked to you about how do we operate. So then the next question is, how do we know? How do you know anything? So if you want to talk about the history of United States government or the history of anything, the question comes up, how do you know what happened? Today, how do you know what happened? Right? Niels showed you the picture of the dancing bear going through the crowd. We all have change blindness. If I asked you after I finished a sentence to repeat it exactly, most of you probably couldn't do it on the first try. The moment something happens, it immediately becomes fabricated in your mind into something else, and it may be closer to the reality, but there is no reality that everybody will agree on, even within 10 minutes of an event. That's why eyewitnesses in crime trials are so notoriously bad. It's because they missed the dancing bear. So how do we know things, and how does that relate to why we study history? Well, if you agree that we can't really know reality because the moment something happens, we all start changing it in our heads, how in the world can we know what happened 200 years ago? Right? How is that possible? And my answer is something that I learned when I was a student, is that the only way you can learn history is to imagine what the person was thinking when the event happened. Because there's only one thing that lives throughout time. It is not the written word, it is not the pottery fragment, it is not some scratching on a wall. People, have you heard the phrase, the facts will speak for themselves? This is not true at all. Facts are mute. Facts never speak for themselves. They speak through you. The only thing that survives time is thought. The only thing you have in common with Caesar is that you are a human being And you can imagine, to the greatest extent that you're capable of if you train yourself, what was Caesar thinking when he crossed the Rubicon? A phrase that's entered our lexicon. When somebody crosses the Rubicon, they have made an irrevocable commitment to a course of action. So you as a historian don't know what Caesar was thinking, but as a human being, if you put part of your brain in his time and part of your brain in the present time, you can imagine what could it have meant to a human being to risk their life to cross the Rubicon and take on conquering the city of Rome. And as a human being, we all would have a different answer to that question. And that's why history books end, but history never does. The next person can ask a much better set of questions, which goes back to how do we know? We don't know. But we can keep asking better questions. What is a better question? A better question is a question that always leads to an answer that leads to a really good question. If your questions lead to a dead end, it's the wrong question. If they keep leading to a better question, now you're writing history. Now you are imagining the world. Let me leap forward a moment. There was a time in our history when Thomas Jefferson was viewed as an intellectual giant. He had all these inventions. He wrote the Declaration of Independence. He was a farmer. He was a philosopher. He spoke French. And then people started writing a different history of Thomas Jefferson. He was a slave owner. He broke up families and sold them into slavery in different places. He had a child by a black slave that he owned. He had a lifelong fight with John Adams. They hated each other. They died on the same day, on July 4th. So if you ask a different set of questions about the life of Thomas Jefferson, you get a very different history. Which one's true? It's all true. There is no one story that's true. They're all true. He was all of those things. And you can choose to write a history based on which part of those questions you want to focus on. So how do we know? We only know because as human beings we are capable of empathy into the past, imagining what somebody was thinking and what they were doing. Now when you do that across cultures, where you are, then it gets really interesting, because it's very difficult to imagine what somebody in another culture thought when a certain thing happened, because you don't have the same vocabulary, emotional context, cultural upbringing to understand what it means to somebody in Africa or the Middle East when a certain event happens as if it happened in New York City or Washington, D.C. So why study history at all? If we can't really know, but we can just imagine, why study history? And my answer to that is there's no such thing as just studying history. It's all connected. You cannot study history without studying psychology and philosophy and sociology and anthropology, because all of those separate disciplines are an illusion. We are one person. We are one kind of society. It is not possible to study history without understanding the psychology or your view of psychology as to why people do what they do. Do they act from motive from the inside, or do they respond to pressure from the outside? This divides the history of psychology. It divides people who are philosophers of history. Some say you're only responding to your environment, and others say people act out of motive and they shape their environment. Which is true? I don't know. I choose to believe we act out of motive. I can't prove it. The same with psychology. How do you know why somebody has a problem? Do you learn about their personal history, or do you just watch and see if something rewards their problem behavior? Freud believed that your history mattered, so he interviewed you about your history from childhood. Other people think your history doesn't matter, it's just what's going on now. Which is true? I don't know. I choose to believe history matters. But so the reason we study history is we can't help it. Because history is nothing more or less than the story of you. Where you came from, the psychology of how you operate, the philosophy of your life, the sociology of your culture, the study of your race and your geography. You can't separate them out. So if you want to talk about the United States government and the birth of the United States government, all the people who developed the United States government from the Revolution were students of philosophy, history, geography, science, and without knowing it, they anticipated in the Constitution of the United States everything we now know about how people act and operate. And by that I mean, what Neil's told you about level 1 and level 2 is represented in the way that our government works. The House of Representatives was always expected to be, and is, the emotional center of our government. It acts out of passion, and the majority rules. That's it. But the Senate was designed specifically to cool the passions of the House, and to have people who operated from analytical strengths, not emotional strengths. They have a longer term of office. They were not elected by the people. They were elected by the state legislatures. Why? They didn't want the passions of the people to rule both houses. They wanted one house to be the passionate and the other house to be the reasonable. And they set it up that way. And there's something else they anticipated, and that was the whole theory of psychoanalysis and Freud. You know, Freud had a philosophy that when you were a child, you operate out of sheer desire. And the most basic desire of an infant is to be at their mother's breast. It's the id. It's what they call the id, the desire. It's strictly desire. You see it, you want it, you grab it. And then he said as you get older, you develop an ego. And an ego is a sense of self. Who am I? Why am I here? Who do I love? Who loves me? And you have the same passion that you had as an infant, but now you've decided you're going to act on it in a more reasonable way. I want money. Maybe I'll steal it. I want to have somebody do what I want them to do. Maybe I'll make them do it. I'll threaten them. And that led to the development of the superego, which is the socially acceptable way to do all those things. No, you may not just go over and ask that person to give you all their money, but you can offer to do something for them and they'll pay you for it. There are these levels of desire, and then control, and then societal control. And without knowing it, they didn't know those terms. The people who wrote our Constitution created our government to represent all of those levels. The House of Representatives is absolutely the id. If they want something, they can vote to get it. But they can't get it. They have to convince the Senate. And the Senate is the ego. They are the ones who say, well, just a minute, before we just go out and do things like, oh, go to war, let's talk about it. Let's think about it. And that's why in the Senate, they have the right to discuss anything as long as they want to. In the House, you can force a vote like that. In the Senate, people have the right to talk. Okay? And then the president is part of that ego. He gets to have his own views of things, but he doesn't have the power of a king, but he has the ability to shape the conversation. And when those egos in the Senate and the White House and the House finally get things done, if it's not societally acceptable under our Constitution, the superego, the Supreme Court, says you can't do that. That's not acceptable because it violates the Constitution, right? How interesting that a group of people who had no idea of that kind of psychology actually built into our Constitution the framework of our minds and the way we work without knowing it. Every other democracy in the world was derived from a king. And so in Britain, if you are the majority party, you have total power. The House of Lords has virtually no power. Now, but the United States, having rejected a king, decided that we would create a different form of government which exists nowhere else. When we go to other countries and set up democracies, we have never set up one that looks like the United States. We set up democracies that look like England, right? In Iraq, we created a parliament, not a Senate and a House the way we have it. In other countries that we have liberated or invaded and then liberated, we have created a democracy that looks like England, not America, because ours is very unique to our history.